In this video, we're going to talk about depth of field and aperture, or f-stop. The diagram here shows a film camera lens, actually, which usually have the apertures on one ring, something called the depth of field scale on the middle ring, and the distance scale on the outer ring. So right now what you're seeing here is f8, which is an aperture that's right in the middle of the scale. It looks like you are maybe 4 or 5 feet away from the subject. And the depth of field scale, which was a handy thing on film camera lenses, you don't see it often on digital camera lenses, but it shows you which aperture you should be at to get things in focus at a certain distance away. So here's an example of how that might work. In this example, there are 3 boys in this scene, and the photographer has shot them at an aperture of f2, which is very wide open. If you see down here, it's the widest aperture that's available on this particular lens. So what this is showing here on the depth of field scale is that at f2, the only thing that's in focus is this small area that is approximately between 6 and 8 feet away from the photographer. So this is showing a couple of things. It's showing a zone focusing area, but it's also showing that when you're at a wide aperture like this, your depth of field is very shallow. In other words, only a very small part of the scene will be in focus, but you can choose which area you want to selectively focus on, in this case, the middle distance. Now here, they've used the smallest aperture, f16, you can see on the lens here. And in this one, all 3 people in the scene are in focus. The depth of field is a full 8-foot area, and what the depth of field scale is showing you here is that at f16, everything from a little less than 5 feet to probably about 13 feet is in focus. And here's a diagram that just shows the different apertures. And when we're talking about full stops, every time you change your aperture setting by a full stop, in one direction you're cutting the light exactly in half, and in the other direction you're exactly doubling the light. This diagram shows the difference in magnification and angle of view between different focal lengths of lens, starting with 17 millimeter up here, which is very, very wide angle in the upper left-hand corner, going to 28, 50, 85, 135, 300, 500, and finally 1,000 millimeter, which is a very, very telephoto setting. This diagram actually shows the degrees measurements of that magnification and angle of view of all of those previous settings. So you can see how different a 17 millimeter is from a 1,000. For portraits, it is generally thought preferable to have a slightly longer lens because it doesn't distort the features as much as a wide-angle lens. And here's a great example of shallow depth of field, image by Elliot Erwitt. The dog and the feet are obviously very sharply focused, but the street is thrown out of focus. It's also a great example of unusual point of view, lying on the ground to take this picture. Again, sharp focus attracts the eye, but when you're at a shallow depth of field setting, you do have the option of selectively focusing, which means you have to put your focus on manual. So obviously in the left-hand picture, the figurine on the front is manually focused on, and in the second, the figure in the back. And this actually is a fairly detailed diagram that just shows where things are on your lens. I won't read through all of these, but briefly, at the bottom here, it's very much like the first slide I showed you, with the aperture control ring on the inner part of the lens, the depth of field scale next to it, and the distance scale on the outer part. Now, while you might not have that on a digital camera lens, you will always have on the end of your lens a little etched in what is the focal length of the lens. In this case, it's a 50 millimeter prime lens or fixed lens. And right next to that should be your maximum aperture. In other words, the lens's widest opening or speed, which appears here as the ratio 1 to 1.8. So if you have a zoom lens, you will not achieve your maximum aperture unless your lens is pulled back, retracted to its widest angle position. And here are just some more examples of shallow depth of field. This is an image by Keith Carter. This is an anonymous image, early 1900s from the Wisconsin Dells. Great depth of field image. Very shallow depth image. Gilles Paris, a photojournalist, image he took in Sarajevo. Obviously great depth of field. So great depth of field, again, is a small aperture. Shallow depth of field is a wide aperture. These next few are by Berenice Abbott, who photographed in New York City a lot in the 1920s when they were building the skyscrapers. And this is Times Square in the early 1930s. Great depth of field. This is an iron worker on the Empire State Building, also great depth of field. So it's easier to get great depth shots in situations like this where the light is very bright. So if you have your aperture closed down to a very small opening, you can get away with that because the light is so bright. This is an image also in New York City many years later. Bruce Davidson from a series he did called Subway, all documentary series on the New York subway. And this is shot at one of the outdoor stations. And he did use a fill flash here, obviously to fill in the shadows of these people in the front. But the great depth of field is very necessary here too, because it shows these tracks with the sunset light on them, which is a big, big part of this, showing the location. This is an image by Roy DeCarava, shot in Harlem in the 1950s. Another great depth of field image shot in bright light, obviously. It was from a collaborative book he did with the writer Langston Hughes called The Sweet Flypaper of Life. This is from a series called Abandoned America by Stephen Gottlieb. Again, shallow depth of field. It's a box of toys found after a house fire. And this is another Keith Carter image. A lot of things going on in this image. It is backlighted, it is a silhouette, and it is also shallow depth of field. Beautiful shot. It's called Fireflies. Another backlighted image showing shallow depth of field. Great depth of field. This is an interesting one. The photographer here is Lee Miller. And this is a portrait of the surrealist painter Max Ernst with his wife, the surrealist painter Dorothea Tanning. And an interesting image. It is not cut and pasted. It is using great depth of field. Small aperture. Another great depth of field shot with a very wide angle lens. So here we really see this extreme angle on these sand dunes. This image is actually from a student project in a beginning class. This student did a whole project on pigeons, and he got down on the level of the pigeons. So again, we talk about point of view here. And in all of these images, the pigeons were very sharp, but the human world up above was all soft focus. So he extensively used shallow depth of field for these. And it's kind of funny because the pigeons are very anthropomorphic, like this one that has attitude. Another Keith Carter image, and here there are actually a couple of things going on. He's used shallow depth of field, but he has also used a view camera with a bellows in the area between the lens and the film. So he actually tweaked the whole focal plane to throw the top out of focus. So there's even more going on here than simply a wide aperture. More from Abandoned America, great depth of field. And more from that, Abandoned Factory, everything in focus from near to far. And a Sally Mann image from her series called At 12, Portraits of Young Women, shot in rural Virginia, probably in the 1980s, but it looks more like the 1880s just because of the setting. And also a beautiful use of flare and backlighting, which doesn't always work, but I think she used it to advantage here. And of course, that rickety looking bridge is a big, big part of this, and the great depth of field and the farmhouse in the distance, everything sharp. Another Sally Mann image from a later project of hers called Immediate Family. And she's really used shallow depth to great advantage here. The girl in the front is obviously the most sharply focused thing. And then this figure up here in the back, which sometimes people don't notice right away, is actually her brother on stilts. But thrown out of focus this way, it has this surrealistic look to it. And this is a diptych, actually. These two images are portraits of Andy Warhol and his mother, taken by Dwayne Michaels, who photographed a lot of artists and celebrities. This is from the 1960s. And both of these he has used shallow depth of field and just altered the selective focusing. So we have Andy Warhol in focus here and his mother in focus here. And they go together. It's a pair. It's a diptych. And then finally, a final Keith Carter image called Willie's Bible. Again, really shallow depth of field. If you look closely, you can see the name Willie written on the side of it here. And it's sharp, but whatever else is going on in this church is soft and a little bit mysterious, rendered through the shallow depth of field. So this concludes our depth of field and aperture slideshow.